Every mission was a calculated bet against death. You climbed into a machine that was not pressurized, not heated, not sealed against the killing cold 6 miles above the Earth, and you flew straight into walls of exploding steel at 200 miles an hour, while men in faster, more agile aircraft tried to tear you out of the sky. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its legendary name, and it earned it honestly. It was tough, it was durable, it absorbed punishment that should have destroyed it and kept flying. But what that name never captured, what the propaganda posters and the newsreel footage never showed you, was what it was like on the inside. What it was like to be one of the 10 men crammed into that aluminum tube for 8, 10, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch, breathing bottled oxygen through a rubber mask, unable to feel your fingers, watching planes just like yours erupt into flame 100 yards away. And knowing with complete clarity that statistically, mathematically, you were probably not going to survive your tour of duty. Today we will describe the dangers faced by the crews of these machines on their extremely risky, nearly suicidal missions, why it was so horrifying to fly in them, the immense courage displayed by these crews who often paid a high price, and the full story of how the most famous bomber in history was also one of the most terrifying places a young man could find himself during the Second World War. And I want to warn you now. Some of what you're about to hear is hard to stomach. These were not abstract statistics. These were real men, most of them barely out of their teens, and what happened to them inside and around these aircraft was genuinely brutal, but they deserve to have their story told in full. So let's start from the beginning. To understand why the B-17 existed, why it was built the way it was, why its crews were asked to do what they were asked to do, you have to go back to the years after the First World War, when the world's military establishments were trying to figure out what lessons that catastrophic conflict had actually taught them. The trenches had defined the war. 4 years of blood-soaked stalemate, millions of men killed for gains measured in hundreds of yards, had convinced a generation of military thinkers that the old ways of fighting were finished. They were right about that much. But what they disagreed on, violently, passionately, institutionally, was what should replace them. For the air power advocates, the answer was obvious. The airplane had appeared in combat for the first time in the First World War, initially as a novelty, a reconnaissance tool, a way of looking over the hill to see what the enemy was doing. But it had evolved with startling speed into a weapon of war in its own right, and by 1918 there were strategic bombing operations underway. German Gotha bombers hitting London, British aircraft striking German industrial targets. The scale was tiny by later standards, the effects modest, but the advocates saw the potential and they ran with it. The airplane, they argued, could bypass the trenches entirely. You didn't have to slog through no man's land to destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war. You could fly over his armies, over his fortifications, and strike directly at the factories, the railways, the fuel depots, the power plants, the industrial nervous system that kept his military alive. Destroy those and his armies would collapse from the inside without you ever having to meet them directly in the field. The man who made this argument most forcefully in the United States was Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, an Army Air Service officer who was so convinced of air power's decisive potential that he essentially destroyed his own career, fighting for it. Mitchell was a showman and a visionary in roughly equal measure. He organised the famous demonstration in 1921 in which his aircraft sank a captured German battleship, the Ostfriesland, which had been considered unsinkable by conventional weapons, proving, he argued, that the battleship era was over and the air age had begun. He argued publicly and loudly that the Army and the Navy needed to cede control of air assets to an independent air force, which made him enemies in every branch of the service. He accused his superiors of incompetence and negligence in a press statement in 1925, which got him court-martialed. He resigned, rather than accept his punishment. He died in 1936 before he could see how completely right he had been. In 1946, Congress posthumously awarded him a Special Medal of Honor. Mitchell was deeply influenced by the Italian general Giulio Douhet, whose 1921 book, The Command of the Air, was essentially the Bible of strategic bombing theory. Douhet's argument was stark and, in some ways, almost gleefully brutal. The next war would be decided by bombing civilians and industrial targets into submission. The key was to achieve air superiority, to destroy the enemy air force, then use that freedom to bomb his cities and factories until his will to resist collapsed. Duhay believed that the terror of aerial bombardment would break civilian morale so rapidly that governments would sue for peace before their armies even engaged. He was wrong about that part. The Second World War would demonstrate repeatedly that bombing civilian populations tended to harden their resolve rather than break it. But the strategic bombing doctrine he inspired became the backbone of Allied air strategy in the Second World War, regardless. In Britain, the theorists at the Royal Air Force's Air Staff reached similar conclusions independently. In the United States, the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama became the center of American strategic bombing doctrine, developing what would become known as ACT doctrine through the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Americans added a crucial refinement to Duhay's thinking: precision daylight bombing. Rather than the nighttime area bombing that the British would eventually embrace, the Americans believed, or convinced themselves, that modern bomb sites and formation flying could allow bombers to hit specific industrial targets with enough accuracy to systematically dismantle an enemy's war-making capacity. You didn't need to burn down entire cities. You needed to knock out the ball-bearing factories, the synthetic oil plants, the aircraft engine works, the railroad marshalling yards. Hit those with enough precision and you surgically removed the enemy's ability to fight. It was a seductive idea. It was also going to prove far more difficult than anyone imagined, and the cost of learning just how difficult would be measured in thousands of young men's lives. To execute this doctrine, the Air Corps needed a bomber. Not just any bomber, a bomber that could fly fast enough and high enough to have a reasonable chance of surviving to its target and back without a fighter escort. The reasoning, flawed as it would prove, was that if you flew high enough and fast enough, enemy fighters couldn't catch you, and if you flew in tight formation with enough defensive guns, any fighters that did engage would be cut down by overlapping fields of fire before they could do serious damage. What you needed was a machine that embodied all of these requirements: long range, high altitude, heavy bomb load, substantial defensive armament, and enough structural strength to absorb combat damage and still get home. The result was the Boeing Model 299, which made its first flight on July 28, 1935, at Boeing Field in Seattle, Washington. It was a genuinely impressive machine, the largest land-based aircraft Boeing had ever built, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet air-cooled radial engines with a wingspan of 103 feet and a length of 68 feet, 9 inches. A reporter from the Seattle Times, watching it taxi toward the runway with its 5 gun turrets prominently bristling from the fuselage, coined the phrase "Flying Fortress," and Boeing was so pleased with the name that they trademarked it immediately. The B-17, as the Army Air Corps designated the prototype, crashed on its evaluation flight at Wright Field in October 1935. Not because of any design flaw, but because a test crew forgot to remove the gust locks on the control surfaces, making the aircraft impossible to control after takeoff. The crash killed the pilot and the Boeing co-pilot on board, and the Army used it as an excuse to order the cheaper, twin-engine Douglas B-18 Bowler in greater quantities. Boeing survived only because the Air Corps bought 13 B-17s for operational testing, and those tests revealed just how impressive the aircraft truly was. The development process moved through several significant variants over the following years. The B-17B, entering service in 1939, replaced the original Wright Cyclone engines with turbo-supercharged Wright R1820-51 engines that gave it significantly better high-altitude performance. It set a transcontinental speed record at over 250 miles per hour. The B-17C and D models introduced self-sealing fuel tanks, better armor protection for crew positions, and revised gun positions. But it was the B-17E, entering production in 1941, that fundamentally transformed the aircraft into the bomber that would go to war. Boeing's engineers had taken a hard look at combat reports from early fighting in Europe and had concluded that the original design was dangerously underarmed at the tail. German fighters had quickly identified that the earliest B-17S had virtually no defensive capability to the rear and had learned to attack from directly behind, sitting in the bomber's blind spot and shooting at their leisure. The B-17E fixed this with a new tailgun position, added a fully rotating top turret just behind the cockpit, replaced the original belly gun position with the revolutionary Sperry ball turret, and added waist gun positions on either side of the fuselage. Tail, top, belly, two sides, the B-17E bristled with machine guns. It also received a longer fuselage, a larger tail for better stability, and a new chin turret under development that would eventually appear on the B-17G. The B-17F was the next major step, arriving in 1942 with a one-piece plexiglass nose, stronger engines, additional fuel capacity, and the ability to carry more bombs. The final and most numerous variant, the B-17G, added the powered chin turret with twin .50 caliber machine guns to address the head-on attack problem, bringing the total armament to 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed across the aircraft. Let's talk about those numbers for a moment, because they matter. The B-17G that flew the vast majority of the 8th Air Force's missions over Europe was 74 feet, 4 inches long, with a wingspan of 103 feet, 9 inches. Fully loaded, it weighed up to 65,500 pounds. It was powered by 4 Wright R1-820-97 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, giving it a maximum speed of 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and a cruising speed of around 182 miles per hour. Its service ceiling was 35,600 feet, though combat operations were typically conducted between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. Its range with a 6,000-pound bomb load was approximately 2,000 miles, and it could carry a maximum internal bomb load of 17,600 pounds over shorter distances, though typical combat loads were considerably less, around 4,000 to 6,000 pounds for long-range missions. And then there were the guns, 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, firing a half-inch diameter bullet at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. On paper, a tight formation of B-17s represented a staggering amount of defensive firepower. The reality, as those crews would discover, was considerably more complicated. The men who flew these aircraft were overwhelmingly young, startlingly, heartbreakingly young by modern standards. The average age of a B-17 crew was below 25 years. The pilot, the man ultimately responsible for the aircraft and everyone in it, might be 22 or 23 years old, with a co-pilot who was perhaps a year younger. The navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, and gunners ranged from 18-year-olds fresh out of their specialized schools to men in their late 20s who were old hands by the standards of their units. These were college students, farm boys, factory workers, gas station attendants, American men from every background imaginable, processed through the Army Air Force's training pipeline at breakneck speed as the war machine expanded to meet the demands of fighting on opposite sides of the world simultaneously. They received their wings and their assignments and found themselves in England in the fall and winter, climbing into aircraft at air bases with names like Thorpe Abbotts, Podington, Bassingbourn and Nettishall, and flying east into Germany. The tour of duty for an 8th Air Force heavy bomber crew was, for most of the war, set at 25 missions. Complete 25 missions and you were done. You could go home, you could take an instructor's position, you were out of the rotation. It sounds almost reasonable until you know the casualty rate. In 1943, the peak year of unescorted daylight bombing, the statistical probability of completing a 25-mission tour without being killed or captured was, by some analyses, less than 1 in 4. The 8th Air Force's Statistical Control Division calculated that the average crewman could expect to survive only about 15 missions. The overall mortality rate for B-17 crews was approximately 20%, meaning 1 in 5 men who flew combat missions in these aircraft was killed. To put that in perspective, the mortality rate was roughly 50 times greater than that of European theatre infantry, and about 10 times greater than Pacific theatre infantry. You were statistically safer climbing out of a landing craft at Omaha Beach than you were completing a tour of duty in the 8th Air Force's heavy bomber groups. That statistic, when it filtered through the crews, had a profound psychological effect that we'll come back to in detail. But first, let's understand exactly what these men were flying into and what the aircraft that was supposed to protect them actually looked like on the inside. The B-17's fuselage was divided into several distinct compartments, each housing one or more crew positions connected by narrow passages that required men in bulky flight gear to turn sideways, crouch, and squeeze through openings barely wide enough for their shoulders. The cockpit at the front of the aircraft was small and narrow, with a low ceiling that required the pilot and co-pilot to duck their heads, the instrument panel inches from their faces, the windows small and scratched. Behind the cockpit, the aircraft opened into the radio compartment, then the bomb bay, a cavernous space running through the center of the fuselage, open to the sky through the bomb bay doors during a mission run, the bombs hanging on their racks on either side. Then the waist section with its two open gun windows, then the narrow tail section where the tail gunner sat in almost complete isolation from the rest of the crew. Underneath the waist section, accessed through a narrow hatch, was the ball turret. Above the cockpit area, the top turret. Out in the nose, behind the transparent plexiglass nose cone, the bombardier and navigator shared a cramped space that offered an extraordinary and terrifying view of everything happening in front of the aircraft. Every one of these men in every one of these positions was wearing the same basic ensemble: electrically heated flight suit worn over layers of regular uniform, fleece-lined boots, fleece-lined gloves with silk inner gloves underneath, a flak vest made of overlapping steel plates sewn into a canvas vest, heavy, clumsy, and only partially effective, a leather helmet with built-in radio headphones, and clamped over the face, the oxygen mask. The oxygen mask was connected by a rubber hose to the aircraft's oxygen supply system, and every crew member above 10,000 feet was entirely dependent on it. If the mask seal broke, if the oxygen line was damaged by enemy fire, if the regulator malfunctioned, or if a crew member for any reason was disconnected from his oxygen supply, the consequences were rapid and terrible. At 25,000 feet, the air contains roughly one-third the oxygen available at sea level. A person breathing the ambient air at that altitude will lose consciousness within seconds to minutes depending on their individual physiology. This is called hypoxia, and one of its most dangerous characteristics is that you often don't feel it coming. One veteran recalls how a crew member who lost oxygen flow to his mask would simply fall asleep, just gently, quietly stop functioning, and if no one helped him, he would be dead within 5 minutes. The insidious part was that the victim usually felt fine, even euphoric, right up until the moment they lost consciousness. Pilots were trained to watch their crew on the interphone, to notice when someone stopped responding, and to immediately check on them. But in the chaos and noise of a combat mission, with enemy fighters pressing in from all sides and flak bursting around the aircraft and the interphone crackling with traffic, crew members had died because no one noticed they'd gone quiet. The temperature inside an unpressurized B-17 at altitude was, to put it bluntly, incompatible with human life if you weren't protected. At 25,000 feet, outside air temperatures routinely dropped to -40 or -50 degrees Celsius. Inside the aircraft, where the fuselage offered minimal insulation, temperatures could drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, -51 Celsius. This is colder than anywhere on the surface of the Earth during a normal winter. It is cold enough to freeze exposed skin within seconds, cold enough to freeze the lubricating oil in a machine gun mechanism, cold enough that blood, actual blood from an actual wound, would freeze as it emerged from the wound. That last detail was the grotesque silver lining that veteran crews sometimes mentioned. If you were hit by shrapnel, and the wound wasn't immediately catastrophic, the brutal cold might actually slow your bleeding enough to keep you alive until the aircraft landed. Several men survived wounds that would have killed them at lower altitudes, purely because their blood froze before they could bleed out. The electrically heated flight suit was supposed to solve the cold problem. It was essentially a garment wired with electrical heating elements, connected to the aircraft's electrical system designed to maintain a survivable temperature against the ambient cold. It worked when it worked. The problem was that it was complex, it was vulnerable, and it had a disconcerting tendency to fail at the worst possible moments. A shrapnel hit to the aircraft's electrical system could cut power to a crew member's suit. A short circuit could cause the suit to overheat and burn the wearer. Burns from malfunctioning heated suits were not uncommon, and getting burns at altitude while being shot at and breathing bottled oxygen was an experience that required a particularly dark kind of fortitude to endure. A slow electrical failure might simply cause the suit to gradually lose heat, and if a crew member didn't notice soon enough, frostbite would begin setting in before he realized what was happening. Frostbite was, in fact, one of the most common injuries sustained by B-17 crews, more common in some units than wounds from enemy action. The extremities were particularly vulnerable: fingers, toes, nose, ears, cheeks. Men were instructed never, under any circumstances, to touch metal with bare skin. The metal surfaces of the aircraft, the gun breeches, the ammunition belts, the structural framework, were at ambient temperature, which meant they were brutally, lethally cold. Touch them with bare skin and the moisture on your skin would freeze instantly, bonding you to the surface. Pull away and you'd leave skin behind. This was not a hypothetical. It happened regularly, particularly to gunners who had to remove their gloves to clear a jam in their weapons. A machine gun jam at altitude was a death sentence if you couldn't clear it quickly. But clearing it might mean removing your gloves, and removing your gloves might mean losing fingers to frostbite before you could get them covered again. Gunners lost fingers this way. They lost fingers frequently enough that it was not considered a remarkable event in a bomb group's medical records. And yet, despite all of this, the cold, the oxygen dependency, the claustrophobia, the bulky gear that made every movement slow and exhausting, what the crews consistently said was hardest about the missions hadn't even started yet, because all of those discomforts existed before they crossed the enemy coast, before the flak started, before the fighters came. The process of assembling a bombing mission began in the dark. Crews were woken hours before dawn, fed breakfast, traditionally eggs, the only meal that got eggs rather than powdered scrambled approximations, because the cooks and the crews both understood that for some percentage of the men sitting in that mess hall, this would be the last real meal they'd ever eat. And then taken to the briefing room. The briefing room was where you found out where you were going. The large map at the front of the room had the target marked, the route in and the route out marked with coloured string, the known flak concentrations marked with red circles. When the curtain was pulled back and the crew saw a deep penetration target, a city in the heart of Germany, a target that meant hours over enemy territory, the reaction in the room was visceral. Men who had been chatting would go quiet. You could see it move across the assembled crews like a physical thing, that sudden understanding of what the day was going to require of them. Then came the briefing itself. Target description, bomb load, formation position, expected opposition, emergency landing fields, rescue procedures. Then the crews dispersed to their aircraft, loaded in the pre-dawn darkness, and began the process of takeoff. Getting a bomber formation airborne was itself a staggeringly dangerous operation, and this is a point that gets lost in the popular memory of strategic bombing. By the way, just during the training and formation assembly phase of operations, as many as 2,800 American airmen were killed in accidents. Not by enemy action, but by the sheer complexity and danger of what they were being asked to do. Dozens of 4-engine heavy bombers, each weighing tens of thousands of pounds, each carrying thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and tons of high explosives, had to take off from the same runway at intervals of only 30 seconds. While one aircraft was still rolling down the runway, the next was already moving up behind it. In darkness, in English fog, in rain, conditions that would have grounded most normal aviation, these operations proceeded because the mission schedule required them to. Mid-air collisions during assembly were not rare. Aircraft that lost an engine on takeoff, overloaded and slow, sometimes couldn't climb away from the terrain and flew into it. And even when all of that went smoothly, the formation assembly process itself, dozens of aircraft climbing through cloud trying to find their assigned positions in the formation without being able to see each other, was a recipe for catastrophe. Collisions in cloud, wingtips coming within feet of other aircraft in turns, pilots so focused on maintaining their position that they flew into the aircraft ahead of them. Training accidents killed hundreds of men who never got close to the enemy. The formation itself, once assembled, was a masterpiece of tactical geometry. The basic unit was the 3-ship element, a lead aircraft flanked by 2 wingmen in an echelon, either to the left and below or to the right and above. 3 elements formed a squadron, and several squadrons arranged in a precise 3-dimensional stacking pattern formed the combat box. The combat box, developed by the 8th Air Force and refined through hard experience, was designed to create the maximum possible overlapping field of fire from the bomber's defensive guns. If you placed aircraft in exactly the right positions, above, below, ahead, behind, to the sides, then an attacking fighter coming in from any direction would find himself flying through a cone of fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. It was elegant in theory. Executed perfectly with experienced crews in ideal conditions, it actually worked reasonably well. The problem was that perfect execution and ideal conditions were not things that combat provided. Maintaining tight formation for hours, through weather, through turbulence, through the violent jinking and manoeuvring that crews instinctively wanted to do when things started exploding around them, this demanded extraordinary skill and physical endurance from pilots. Flying formation in a four-engine heavy bomber is not like flying formation in a fighter. The aircraft responds slowly. It has enormous inertia, and it takes constant input, constant, precise, physically exhausting input to keep it in its assigned position. Pilots emerged from long missions physically wrecked, their arms and shoulders aching from the constant pressure on the controls, their eyes strained from hours of staring at the aircraft a few feet away from them and trying to maintain exact spacing. And throughout all of this, they could not break formation without jeopardizing the defensive integrity of the entire group. An aircraft that lagged behind, that straggled, for any reason, engine trouble, battle damage, a pilot who was wounded and struggling to maintain control, became instantly vulnerable. German fighter pilots knew exactly what a straggler looked like, and they knew exactly what to do about it. But all of that, the formation flying, the training accidents, the oxygen dependency, the killing cold, was the background against which the real terror operated. The real terror was the German air defense system, and it was, by 1943, one of the most lethal and sophisticated defensive networks ever constructed. The Germans had not been idle. From the moment the strategic bombing campaign began in earnest, the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht had been building, expanding, and refining a layered air defense system of extraordinary depth and complexity. It began with radar, a chain of radar stations stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, providing early warning of incoming formations. The radar data fed into a command network called the Kammhuber line, actually a series of overlapping radar-controlled defensive zones, each with its own fighter control facility, directing night fighters to radar contacts. For daylight operations, the system worked differently, but with similar effectiveness. Ground observers and radar stations would track the incoming bombers, and fighter control centers would vector interceptors into position. By the time a B-17 formation crossed the Dutch or Belgian coast, the Germans usually knew exactly how many aircraft were coming, roughly what direction they were heading, and approximately how much time they had to get their fighters airborne and into position. And on the ground, waiting for the bombers that the fighters couldn't stop or didn't reach in time, were the guns. The Germans called anti-aircraft artillery Flugzeugabwehrkanone, aircraft defense cannon, abbreviated to flak, and the word became one of the most feared in the English language for any Allied bomber crewman. The German flak arm at its peak deployed tens of thousands of guns of various calibers around the Reich cities and industrial installations, operated by hundreds of thousands of men, and increasingly as manpower became scarce by teenage boys and women who were drafted into the flak auxiliaries. They were very, very good at their jobs. The backbone of the heavy flak arm was the 8.8 centimeter Flak 18 and its successor, the Flak 36 and Flak 41, the famous 88mm cannon that became perhaps the most feared artillery piece of the entire war. Originally designed in the late 1920s and early 1930s as a dual-purpose gun capable of engaging both aircraft and ground targets, the 88's combination of high muzzle velocity, excellent rate of fire, and devastating shell made it brutally effective at altitude. The gun fired a shell weighing approximately 20 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,690 feet per second, reaching an effective ceiling of over 26,000 feet and a maximum ceiling of nearly 35,000 feet. Well within the operating altitude of B-17 formations, the gun's practical rate of fire was between 15 and 20 rounds per minute, and a well-trained crew could push that higher in short bursts. The 88 was not alone. The Germans also deployed 10.5 centimeter and 12.8 centimeter guns for heavy flak. The 12.8 centimeter Flak 40 in particular was a monster weapon capable of reaching 48,000 feet and firing a shell nearly 3 times the weight of the 88's projectile. Around lower altitude threats, they ranged 3.7 centimeters and 2 centimeter automatic cannon that created impenetrable curtains of fire below 15,000 feet. The heavy flak guns around major targets, Schweinfurt, Hamburg, Berlin, Ploesti, were organized into flak divisions with hundreds of guns, all coordinated through fire control computers that took radar data on the incoming formation and calculated firing solutions based on the formation's altitude, speed, and heading. A battery would fire all its guns in coordinated salvos, each shell fused to detonate at a calculated altitude, the goal being to fill a specific cube of airspace with lethal shrapnel at the precise moment the bomber formation entered it. The flak shells were designed to explode at a predetermined altitude, scattering a pattern of steel fragments, jagged, irregular, razor-edged chunks of casing, in a roughly spherical pattern around the burst point. A direct hit from an 88mm shell was almost certainly catastrophic. The shell contained roughly 2 pounds of high explosive, and detonating inside or immediately adjacent to a B-17 would typically destroy it instantly, turning it into a tumbling ball of fire that fell away from the formation in pieces. But direct hits were, in the statistical scheme of things, relatively rare. What was not rare was the near miss, and the near miss was what killed men systematically, methodically, mission after mission. The B-17's fuselage was constructed primarily from 24S aluminum alloy, strong enough for an airframe but not remotely strong enough to stop shrapnel. A piece of flak the size of a man's fist, travelling at supersonic speed, punched through aluminum like it was paper. A piece the size of a thumbnail could still kill a man. The unpredictability of flak. You never knew where the next burst would be. You never knew if the piece of metal travelling at you was the one that would punch through the fuselage and take off your arm. Created a particular kind of psychological pressure that was different from the fear of fighter attack. With fighters, you could see them coming. You could respond, you could track them, you could fire back. With flak, you could only fly through it. The crew could hear the bursts, a sharp, flat crack that they described as sounding like someone banging on the fuselage with a wrench, and they could smell the cordite that drifted through the aircraft at altitude, a sulphurous, acrid smell that meant the burst had been close. They would feel the aircraft lurch or shudder when a burst was very near, and they could see, through their gun windows and their plexiglass positions, the bursts appearing around the formation in clusters of black smoke, each one a sphere of expanding gas and lethal metal, each one in a slightly different place, the pattern moving through the formation as the German gunners walked their fire. Airmen could see nearby planes getting hit, a burst alongside the wing and suddenly the wing was gone, or a burst under the bomb bay and suddenly the aircraft's back was broken, or a burst directly in front of the cockpit and suddenly the aircraft was simply gone, replaced by a shower of burning debris. Watching this happen. Watching a plane you recognized containing men you ate breakfast with that morning vanish in a fraction of a second. Watching for parachutes and counting them, 6, 7, 8, or watching and seeing none at all. Knowing that right now, at this moment, as you watch that burning thing falling, all the men inside it who didn't get out are still alive, still conscious possibly as the aircraft falls, and they cannot get out. And all the while you are wondering if you are next. German fighters were the other half of the killing equation, and in some ways they were more frightening than the flak, simply because they were active, they were aggressive, and they were flown by men who were getting better at killing B-17 with every engagement. By 1943, the Luftwaffe day fighter force deployed against the American bombers was equipped primarily with 2 aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190. Both were exceptional aircraft, both faster and more maneuverable than any bomber could hope to be, and both were armed with a combination of cannon and machine guns that could inflict catastrophic damage on a B-17 in a single, well-executed pass. The Bf-109G, the primary variant in service in 1943, was armed with a 30mm Mk-108 cannon firing through the propeller hub, 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the cowl, and often 2 20mm MG-151 cannon in underwing gondolas. A single 30mm shell from the Mk-108 hitting a B-17's wing could sever a spar. The Fw-190A8 carried 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, delivering a weight of fire that could tear an engine off its mounts. The German fighter pilots developed specific tactics for attacking the bomber formations, and they were constantly adapting and refining those tactics as they learned more about the B-17's defensive capabilities and weaknesses. The classic early tactic was the tail attack, diving in from behind and below where the original B-17 models were weakest, firing from maximum range and closing at high speed. When the B-17E and subsequent models added the tailgun position and strengthened other defensive armament, the Germans shifted to a new and more alarming approach, the frontal attack, or Sturmangriff. In a frontal attack, German fighters would position themselves several miles ahead of the incoming formation, at the same altitude or slightly higher, then turn and dive directly at the lead aircraft, firing as they came. The closing speed was enormous. The fighter coming in at 350 miles per hour, meeting the formation coming at 180 miles per hour, meant a closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, which gave the fighter perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of effective firing time and gave the B-17's nose gunners the same terrifyingly brief window to respond. But the geometry of the attack was devastating. The fighter was aiming directly at the cockpit and the bombardier's position, the most vulnerable points of the aircraft, and the B-17's nose, for most of the early and mid-war models, was the least well-defended sector. The frontal attack required extraordinary nerve from the German pilot. He was flying directly at a formation of aircraft that might be firing back at him, and his margin for pulling away before collision was extremely thin, but it was devastatingly effective. A concentrated burst from a FW-190's cannon, fired head-on into a B-17's nose, might kill the pilot and co-pilot simultaneously, leaving a heavy bomber full of fuel and bombs with no one at the controls at 25,000 feet. When the B-17G introduced the chin turret with twin .50 caliber guns. Specifically to address this vulnerability, the Germans adapted again, forming up into large groups, Sturmgruppen, that would overwhelm the defensive fire through sheer weight of numbers and then blast through the formation at close range. What the early planners who designed the doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing failed to understand, what they simply refused to accept until the casualty figures made denial impossible, was that no bomber, however heavily armed, however tightly formatted, could fight its way through a determined and skilled fighter defense without sustaining catastrophic losses over time. The mathematics were brutal and simple. German pilots could take their time choosing their targets. They could attack from favorable angles, break away before the defensive guns could track them, form up again, and attack again. They could afford to take losses because the aircraft they were destroying cost far more in training time and resources to replace than the fighters they were losing. And they were motivated by the clearest possible incentive. The bombers were flying over their country, over their cities, over their families. They were not going to stop fighting because someone had arranged 13.50 caliber machine guns in an elegant overlapping pattern. The P-51 Mustang would eventually change the equation decisively, its long range allowing it to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, and its performance allowing it to take on the Luftwaffe's best fighters on equal or superior terms. But that was still in the future. In 1943, the men climbing into their B-17S on the hardstands of East Anglia were flying into what was arguably the most dangerous air combat environment in history, with a doctrine that was costing them their lives at a rate that in any rational analysis should have prompted an immediate halt to operations. It did not prompt a halt. The missions continued, and the men who flew them kept climbing into those aircraft morning after morning to do it again. Now, let's explain the crew and some of the positions on the aircraft, because understanding what each of these men was doing and where they were doing it is essential to understanding what the experience actually meant at the level of the individual human being. And then we will describe what would happen when an aircraft was hit, and the fate of its crew. The 10 men who made up a B-17 crew did not simply occupy a vehicle together. They formed an interdependent system, each member essential to the survival of the whole, each dependent on every other in ways that were sometimes obvious and sometimes deeply counterintuitive. The pilot and co-pilot up front in the cockpit were the most visible and most immediately critical members. Without them, the aircraft didn't fly. But the tail gunner, alone at the very end of the fuselage in his isolated little compartment, was just as critical to the survival of the crew as the pilot. If an attack came from the rear and the tail gunner's guns were silent, every other man in the aircraft paid for it. They understood this. It was one of the things that bound B-17 crews together with a ferocity that veterans still spoke of 60 years later. This knowledge that their survival was completely, irreversibly dependent on every other man doing his job perfectly, in conditions that made doing anything perfectly almost impossible. The pilot sat in the left seat, the co-pilot in the right, and between them they managed an aircraft that required constant active input. The B-17 was known for being relatively stable and forgiving, which made it an excellent formation platform, but it still required two men to operate effectively and safely, particularly in combat when systems might be failing, control surfaces might be damaged, and the demands on the pilots were beyond what any single person could handle. The co-pilot was not a passenger. He was an equal partner in keeping the aircraft flying, and in emergencies, he might be the only pilot left. Several B-17s made it back to England with a dead pilot and a co-pilot who had never expected to be flying solo. Behind and between the pilots, connected to the fuselage by a short step up, was the top turret. The Sperrio 1 top turret was a powered, hydraulically actuated bubble of plexiglass, mounting 2.50 caliber M2 machine guns, capable of rotating a full 360 degrees in azimuth and elevating from horizontal to nearly vertical. The man inside it, typically the flight engineer whose primary job when not firing was to monitor the aircraft's mechanical systems and assist the pilots, had an extraordinary view. He could see the entire upper hemisphere of the aircraft's surroundings. He was also extremely visible, positioned just behind the cockpit where he presented a clear target profile from above and the sides. German fighter pilots specifically targeted the top turret because eliminating it removed coverage from one of the most important defensive sectors of the aircraft. The turret gunner knew this, and he fired back with the understanding that enemy fighters were specifically trying to kill him while he was trying to kill them. The operational life expectancy of top turret gunners in units with high loss rates was not something the Army Air Forces put in recruitment posters. Down in the nose of the aircraft, the bombardier and navigator shared a space that was simultaneously the most dramatic and among the most exposed positions on the B-17. The nose section of the aircraft was a large cone of plexiglass, the bubble-shaped plexiglass nose cap that gave the B-17 its distinctive profile from the front, offering an almost unobstructed view forward and downward. On the bombing run, the bombardier lay prone over the Norden bomb site, one of the most closely guarded pieces of technology in the American arsenal, peering through the eyepiece at the ground miles below and making minute adjustments that would determine whether the bombs hit their target. The Norden was a remarkable piece of electromechanical engineering, a gyroscopically stabilized optical sight connected to an analog computer that could, in theory, automatically account for the aircraft's speed, altitude, heading, wind drift, and bomb ballistics to deliver ordnance with remarkable precision. In theory. In practice, bombing from 25,000 feet through haze, clouds, smoke, and flak bursts, with the aircraft maneuvering to avoid fighters and the bomb site subject to the same vibration and turbulence as everything else in the aircraft, the results were considerably less precise than the training demonstrations suggested. But the bombardier didn't have the luxury of worrying about that during the bomb run. For the several minutes of the run itself, the aircraft was forbidden from taking evasive action. It had to fly straight and level, at constant speed and altitude, while the bombardier guided it to the release point. Straight and level. Into the flak. For minutes at a time, this was the moment that every crew dreaded most, and the moment when German flak batteries, who could see from the bomber's behavior that it was on a bomb run, would concentrate their fire most intensively. The radio operator occupied a position in the fuselage between the bomb bay and the waist section, responsible for communication with the formation lead, with fighter escorts when they existed, and with the air-sea rescue if the aircraft went down over water. The radio operator also manned a single .50 caliber gun firing upward through a hatch in the top of the fuselage. An awkward, exposed position that made him vulnerable to strafing attacks from above, while also giving him his only chance to fight back. On missions where the interphone system was damaged, the radio operator became the communications hub for the entire crew, carrying messages physically between crew positions, squeezing through the cramped passages in full flight gear, fighting the wind if the aircraft was damaged and the fuselage was open to the outside, delivering information and receiving it in a way that modern soldiers would find incomprehensible. And then there were the positions that veterans consistently identified as the most dangerous, the most physically demanding, and the most psychologically difficult. Those positions deserve their own detailed attention because they are where the human story of the B-17 becomes most visceral, most personal, most impossible to forget. We'll get to those in the next part of our story. Phase 2. To understand what it meant to be a waist gunner, you have to stop thinking about the B-17 as a vehicle and start thinking about it as an environment, a hostile, almost incomprehensible environment that happened to be made of aluminum and held together by rivets and faith. The waist section of the aircraft in the B-17E and F models featured two open gun windows, one on each side of the fuselage, through which the waist gunners tracked and fired their .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Open. Not glass, not plexiglass with a flexible mount. Open. Rectangular holes in the side of the aircraft, each roughly 18 inches by 18 inches, through which the gunners leaned their weapons and their bodies, exposed to the full force of the 200 miles per hour slipstream and the -50-degree air. Even in the B-17G, which introduced a staggered arrangement of the waist windows and eventually partial glazing for some aircraft, the waist section was among the most brutally exposed positions in the entire formation. The two waist gunners stood, or more accurately crouched and braced themselves, in a space that was not designed for two large men in bulky flight gear to occupy simultaneously. They stood on their feet, unlike the tail gunner who had at least a rudimentary seat, holding their guns, fighting the wind, freezing, trying to track fast-moving targets through the open windows while the aircraft bounced and lurched through turbulence and tried to evade attacks. Their field of view was limited by the angle of the window, their field of fire was limited by the physical constraints of the mount, and their bodies were limited by the cold in ways that progressively, over the course of a long mission, reduced their ability to function. Frostbite typically began in the extremities, fingers first, then toes, and the problem for waist gunners was that their gloves, however well insulated, still could not fully compensate for hours of exposure to air at -50 degrees, particularly when those gloves were in contact with metal. The gun barrels, the ammunition belts, the gun mount that was conducting heat away from their hands at a brutal rate. One veteran from the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn describes what a typical mission felt like from the waist position. By the time the formation crossed the enemy coast, maybe 90 minutes after takeoff, his feet were already numb. By the time they reached the target, he had largely stopped feeling his hands below the wrist. He could still operate the gun mechanically. The technique was more about leaning into the weapon and pressing the trigger with the palm of his hand than any fine motor operation. But he was functioning on instinct and training rather than sensation. And through all of this, German fighters were coming at the formation from the side, and it was his job to track them and fire and try to make them stop. The psychological challenge of this, of trying to perform a precise, skilled task while your body was shutting down from cold and your mind was processing the spectacle of burning aircraft and exploding shells all around you, was something that veterans struggled to articulate for the rest of their lives. Not because they didn't have words for it, but because the words didn't quite fit the experience. In the early B-17E and F models, the two waist gunners worked in such a confined space that they routinely interfered with each other during engagements. When both were tracking and firing simultaneously, the movement of one affected the other, and in the heat of combat this could mean the difference between tracking a fighter correctly and swinging the gun into empty air, while the target slipped past. The B-17G's staggered windows, with the left window moved forward and the right window moved aft relative to each other, helped somewhat with this problem. But the fundamental issue of two large men in a small space trying to simultaneously operate large, powerful weapons against fast-moving targets never entirely went away. The other thing that distinguished the waist position from most others on the aircraft was the nature of what the gunners saw. The pilots and bombardier faced forward, their view dominated by the formation ahead and the sky beyond. The tail gunner faced backward, his world a cone of trailing airspace. But the waist gunners faced sideways, and what they saw, mission after mission, was the full panorama of the air battle as it unfolded around them. They could see the entire width of the formation, dozens of aircraft stacked above and below, ahead and behind, a massive geometric structure of aluminum and ordnance moving through the sky at 2 miles a minute. They could see fighters coming in from the flanks, could watch other B-17 take hits, could see men fall from aircraft, could see parachutes, or the absence of parachutes. They had, in some senses, the most complete view of the battle of anyone in the aircraft, and it was a view that scarred men permanently. One gunner from the 391st Bomb Group recalled watching the aircraft next to his take a direct flak hit to the number 3 engine. The engine disappeared in a ball of orange and black, and the aircraft immediately began to fall out of formation, trailing fire. He counted the parachutes, he got to 4 before the aircraft entered a spin, and the centrifugal force made it impossible for anyone else inside to reach an exit. He watched it all the way to the cloud layer below. He couldn't stop watching. 4 parachutes, 10 men. He knew some of them personally. They'd been at the same briefing that morning. And yet, remarkably, consistently, the history of the 8th Air Force bomber groups shows that men return to their positions after witnessing things like that. They climbed back into the aircraft. They flew the next mission, and the one after that. The psychological literature on combat stress and resilience is extensive, but even by its standards, what the bomber crews demonstrated was extraordinary. A kind of compartmentalized courage that allowed them to continue functioning in conditions of genuine, sustained, mortal terror. Now let's talk about the ball turret, because the ball turret deserves its own extended discussion, and not only because it was among the most physically and psychologically extreme positions in the aircraft. The Sperry ball turret, designated the A-2 ball turret in the B-17, was one of the more audacious pieces of weapons engineering produced during the war, and it is difficult to fully convey, without having seen one in person, just how extraordinary a thing it is to look at. It was a spherical pod, roughly 44 inches in diameter, 44 inches, which is about the diameter of a small dining room table, bolted to the underside of the B-17's fuselage just aft of the bomb bay. Inside this sphere, which rotated hydraulically in both azimuth and elevation, a man sat in a fetal-like position, his knees up near his chest, his back curved against the lower hemisphere of the turret, his feet in 2 small stirrups, his face pressed against the optical sight in the center, his hands on the 2 triggers. 2.50 caliber M2 machine guns, one on either side of his head, pointed downward and outward. The entire assembly, gunner included, rotated to track targets below and to the sides of the aircraft, able to cover the full lower hemisphere from directly below to horizontal in any direction. The turret weighed about 627 pounds empty. The gunner added to that. To enter the turret from the aircraft, the crew member had to rotate the turret to a specific alignment where the entry hatch in the upper surface of the ball lined up with a hatch in the aircraft floor. He then lowered himself through the aircraft hatch, feet first, into the ball, folded himself into position, and closed the hatch above him. He was now entirely enclosed in a steel and plexiglass sphere the size of a compact car's trunk, separated from the rest of the aircraft by the hatch above him, suspended over 6 miles of open air below him through a plexiglass panel the size of a dinner plate. And he was staying there for the duration of the mission. Hours. In the cold, in the noise, in that position. Unable to stretch, unable to change posture significantly, unable to see most of his crewmates, able only to communicate through the interphone headset built into his helmet. Unable, critically, to wear his parachute because there was no room in the turret for a parachute pack. The chute was stored in the aircraft attached to the entry hatch, and the gunner was supposed to rotate the turret to the entry position, open the hatch, grab the chute, snap it to his harness, and then exit through the aircraft interior in an emergency. Supposed to, in a functioning aircraft with time, this was possible. In an aircraft that was falling apart, burning, spinning, or structurally compromised, this sequence of events was very often not possible. And that brings us to the central nightmare of the ball turret gunner's existence, the hydraulics. The turret rotated to its entry position using hydraulic pressure. If the aircraft's hydraulic system was damaged by flak, by enemy cannon fire, by any of the dozen ways an aircraft system could be compromised in combat, the turret might not be able to rotate to its entry alignment. There were only 2 positions from which the gunner could exit the turret into the aircraft. The gun's level position, with the turret aligned horizontally with the fuselage, and the guns up position, with the guns pointing straight up into the aircraft. Any other position, and the entry hatch was not accessible from inside the aircraft. If the turret was stuck in the wrong position and the hydraulics were gone, the ball turret gunner had no way out. He was trapped in his steel sphere attached to the underside of the aircraft, with the ground miles below him and no prospect of rescue. This happened. It is not a theoretical horror. It is a documented reality that occurred on multiple occasions during the bombing campaign, and the ball turret gunners who had experienced near misses with hydraulic failure were among the most psychologically affected members of any B-17 crew. The mental exercise of imagining yourself in that position, aircraft going down, crew bailing out above you, the hatch above your head inaccessible, the ground coming up from below, was something that ball turret gunners thought about with a particular intimacy that other crew positions simply didn't have to confront in quite the same way. The tail gunner might be trapped in a tumbling aircraft. The waist gunner might be thrown around by a spin, but the ball turret gunner had a specific, identifiable, and almost impossibly cruel version of that fate mapped out in advance, and he climbed into his turret on every mission knowing it. The physical requirements for ball turret duty reflected the constraints of the space. The Army Air Forces generally sought men who were no taller than 5 feet 5 inches and no heavier than about 150 pounds for ball turret assignment, not because smaller men were braver or more skilled, but because larger men simply did not fit. This meant that ball turret gunners were disproportionately young men who had not yet grown to full adult size. 18 and 19-year-olds who had arrived at their bomb groups before they'd had enough time in the army to put on weight. There was a grim irony in this. The men the military assigned to the most mechanically claustrophobic, most hydraulically dependent, most difficult to escape position were systematically the youngest, the smallest, and in many cases, the least experienced. They were still teenagers. And they climbed into that ball, and they flew, and they fired, and they came back. Or they didn't. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the aircraft, the tail gunner occupied his own specialized and extremely uncomfortable world. The tailgun position was, in most ways, the most isolated spot on the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage, connected only by the interphone wire running back through the aircraft's structure. To reach the tail position, a crew member had to crawl through the narrow tail section on hands and knees, squeezing past the hydraulic lines, the electrical cables, the structural ribs, a passage barely wide enough for a man in full flight gear. At the end of this passage was the tailgun position itself, a small, cramped compartment containing twin .50 caliber machine guns mounted in a ball and socket mounting, a rudimentary padded rest that served as something between a seat and a kneeling position, and 2 small windows of bulletproof glass through which the gunner could see the sky behind the aircraft. The tail gunner knelt or half knelt on a modified bicycle seat style support, his knees on the floor, his body bent forward, his eyes behind the sight, his hands on the guns. For missions lasting 8, 10, 12 hours, this was his universe. What the tail gunner saw was the entire formation behind the lead aircraft. All the other B-17 stacked in the combat box, their contrails spreading out behind them, the geometric pattern, gradually dissolving as aircraft were hit and fell away, or as formation discipline broke down in combat. He also saw everything that came at the aircraft from the rear. German fighters diving on the formation from above and behind, rolling in from the sides and converting their angle into a tail attack, coming up from below at the 6 o'clock low position. His job was to identify these attacks as early as possible, call them out on the interphone so the rest of the crew knew what was happening, and engage the fighters with his guns while they were still far enough away to be deterred. When a German fighter pilot chose to make a tail attack on a formation aircraft, the tail gunner was the first and often only thing standing between that fighter's cannon and the rest of his crew. The tail position was also statistically one of the more frequently hit positions on the aircraft, simply because tail attacks, while less common than they had been before the addition of the tail gun, were still a staple of Luftwaffe fighter doctrine against B-17 formations. A burst from a Bf-109's cannon that entered the tail section might kill the gunner instantly, might wound him severely enough to put him out of action while leaving the guns silent, or might damage the tail structure and compromise the aircraft's handling. Many tail gunners flew their missions knowing that if the aircraft took a serious hit from the rear, they were the most likely to catch it first. One particularly grim feature of the tail position was the issue of bailout in an emergency. If the pilot gave the bailout signal, typically a bell or a light in the tail position since the interphone might be damaged, the tail gunner had to extricate himself from his kneeling position, crawl back through the narrow passage toward the waist section and reach the nearest exit, all while the aircraft might be spinning, burning, or in a steep dive. The tail was the farthest point from any exit. In a rapidly deteriorating situation, the difference between survival and death for a tail gunner might literally be the extra 30 seconds it took to cover that distance. Veterans who had managed to get out in emergencies often described the crawl back through the tail section under adverse conditions as the single most terrifying physical experience of their lives. The aircraft pitching and rolling, the structure groaning around them, the exits apparently impossibly far away. Let's also spend some time with the bombardier and the navigator, because their experience of the mission was distinctly different from the gunners and in some ways more psychologically complex. The navigator's job was to get the aircraft where it was supposed to be. Using a combination of dead reckoning, celestial navigation, radio beacons, and map reading, he was responsible for the route in, the route to the target, and the route home. In conditions of good visibility and when everything was working properly, this was demanding but manageable work. In conditions of cloud cover, radio jamming, heavy combat maneuvering, and the general chaos of a contested airspace, it was extraordinarily difficult. Navigators who made errors, who gave the pilot a wrong heading, who misjudged a wind correction, who lost their position in the overcast, did not simply fail a test. They might take their entire crew into a defended area they weren't expecting, or miss the fighter rendezvous point and leave the formation without escort, or put the aircraft over a different city's flak concentration than the briefed route. The weight of that responsibility, carried for hours through combat conditions, took a specific kind of toll on the men who bore it. The bombardier's experience during the bomb run was a study in controlled terror. For approximately 3 to 5 minutes, the length of the final bombing approach, he was in control of the aircraft through the bomb site's automatic pilot connection, making the final adjustments to the aircraft's heading and altitude to align with the target. During this time, the pilot relinquished control. The aircraft could not maneuver. All the B-17 could do was fly straight and level at consistent speed and altitude, while the flak gunners below, who could see from the formation's behavior that it was on a bomb run, concentrated everything they had on that precise piece of sky. The bombardier, lying on his stomach over the bomb site, his eye pressed to the eyepiece, was making tiny adjustments to the crosshairs while his aircraft was being systematically shot at. He could not look up. He could not think about the flak. He could only focus on the crosshairs and the target and the numbers, and when the moment came, he pressed the bomb release called "Bombs Away" on the interphone, and the aircraft immediately lurched upward as several thousand pounds of ordnance fell away, and the pilot immediately began evasive maneuvering. Those 3 to 5 minutes, repeated over a bombing career of 25 missions, were enough to leave permanent psychological damage on men who were otherwise functioning well. The navigator sat adjacent to the bombardier in the nose compartment, and both men were exposed to something that other crew positions were largely spared: the direct visual experience of the formation's losses during the bomb run. Flying in formation, particularly in the lead or low squadrons, meant that you could see everything happening to aircraft around you. The nose position offered the best overall view of the formation, and on a bomb run, that view was of the worst possible moment. Fighters making head-on attacks came straight at the nose position. Flak was concentrated in front of the formation as it approached. Aircraft taking catastrophic hits fell past the nose position, sometimes close enough that the crew could see into the cockpit of the stricken aircraft as it fell. There is a particular kind of courage required to maintain your focus on a bomb site while this is happening around you, and the men who did it consistently for 25 missions are among the most remarkable figures in American military history. Now let's get into the specific mechanics of what happened when an aircraft was hit, because the phrase "aircraft was hit" covers an enormous range of outcomes and consequences that are worth examining in detail. The German 88mm flak shell and the 30mm cannon rounds fired by German fighters created entirely different types of damage, and the B-17's response to different kinds of damage was itself a crucial factor in whether any of the crew survived. A flak burst near the aircraft produced a pattern of shrapnel fragments travelling outward from the burst point. The closest fragments travelled fastest and hit hardest. A fragment that penetrated the fuselage while the crew was aboard might simply punch a hole through the aluminum and exit the other side, harmless except as a reminder of how close the burst was. Or it might intersect with a crew member's body, or it might sever a hydraulic line, or cut a fuel line, or puncture a fuel tank, or destroy an elevator control cable. The insidious thing about flak damage was its randomness. You couldn't predict which fragments would hit, where they would go, what they would cut or puncture. aircraft returned to base with hundreds of small holes from flak bursts and no crew casualties. Aircraft were shot out of the sky by a single fragment that severed the wrong cable at the wrong moment. Pilots who survived many missions spoke of a kind of fatalistic attitude toward flak that they said was necessary for mental survival. You could see the bursts, you could feel the near misses through the airframe, but you couldn't do anything about it, and dwelling on it would consume you. You flew through it, and you trusted that today was not your day. When a crew member was wounded by flak or gunfire, the men around him faced a specific and terrible challenge. The aircraft's flying altitude meant that conventional medical treatment was almost impossible. Oxygen masks couldn't be removed without endangering the victim's life. The cold, as mentioned, acted as a kind of brutal anesthetic and coagulant, but it also complicated assessment of wound severity. A man who appeared to be in mild shock might be dying. The aircraft carried morphine syringes, individual syrettes in the medical kit, and crew members were trained to administer morphine injections to wounded colleagues. But morphine at altitude, combined with oxygen deprivation and extreme cold, had unpredictable effects. Crew members had died from morphine administered in good faith by men doing everything they could to help. The bombardier or navigator in the nose position, wounded and unable to move, might simply have to lie where he was for the remainder of the mission. The ball turret gunner, wounded inside the turret, might not be able to exit under his own power. The tail gunner, if seriously hit, might die alone at the far end of the aircraft before anyone could reach him. The aircraft's first aid equipment was rudimentary by any standard. Sulfur powder and field dressings, morphine, and tourniquets. The medical kit of a B-17 was roughly equivalent to what a combat infantryman might carry, applied to wounds sustained at 25,000 feet, in conditions that made even basic first aid enormously difficult. Crew members applied pressure to wounds with their gloved hands. They used the cold itself sometimes by pressing bare metal against a bleeding point, a grotesque application of the one resource the aircraft had in abundance. They talked to wounded colleagues through the interphone, keeping them conscious, keeping them focused, keeping them from giving up. One navigator in the 95th Bomb Group described keeping up a running commentary to a badly wounded pilot for 40 minutes, while the co-pilot flew the aircraft home and the navigator held his hands on the pilot's wound, talking about the pilot's hometown, about the baseball scores, about a bar they'd been to together in London, about anything and everything except what was happening in that cockpit, until they crossed the coast of England and the pilot, still alive, understood that he was going to make it. The decision to continue to the target or abort the mission was one of the most fraught a commander could face. Officially, the criteria for aborting were specific and limited. Mechanical failure that made the aircraft unable to maintain formation, crew casualties that eliminated essential functions. In practice, the pressure on crews not to abort was enormous. Turning back meant the formation lost an aircraft from its defensive box. It meant appearing to the rest of the crew, who were continuing to the target, as if you had chosen safety over duty. The stigma attached to an abort that later proved unjustifiable was severe enough that some crews continued missions they should have turned back from, pressing onto the target with damaged engines, with wounded crew members, with compromised systems, because they could not face the judgment of their peers. This kind of pressure killed men who might otherwise have survived, but it also produced acts of flying and endurance that defy easy categorization. Men who got their aircraft and crew home through damage and circumstances that by any engineering standard should have been unsurvivable, because they had committed to the idea that they were going to get their people home, and they refused to accept the alternative. The German defensive network was not static. It evolved continuously throughout the bombing campaign, adapting to American tactics and finding new vulnerabilities with each engagement. One particularly effective German innovation was the Sturmgruppe, the assault group developed specifically to counter the defensive firepower of tight B-17 formations. A Sturmgruppe consisted of specially armoured and heavily armed FW-190s. The FW-190A-8/R2 variant carried additional armour plating around the cockpit and additional armament in the form of two 30mm MCOL 108 cannon in the outer wing positions in addition to the standard armament that would attack the bomber formation from directly behind, closing to within 100 yards or less before opening fire. The rationale was simple and brutal. At such close range, the probability of hitting and destroying the target was extremely high, even if the fighter took defensive fire on the way in. The heavy armoring reduced the risk from defensive .50 caliber fire enough to make the trade acceptable. These Sturmgruppe pilots were among the most aggressive fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, and they accepted a tactical philosophy that was borderline suicidal in its insistence on extremely close engagement distances. They were also extremely effective, and their attacks against B-17 formations in 1944 produced some of the highest single engagement loss rates of the entire bombing campaign. What made the Sturmgruppe particularly terrifying from the bomber's perspective was the element it introduced into the already nightmarish experience of the bomb run. The Sturmgruppe pilots would time their attacks to coincide with the moment the formation was committed to its bomb run, when the aircraft could not maneuver, when every gun was already occupied scanning for threats, when the bomb bay doors were open, and the formation was in its most vulnerable state. A wave of heavily armoured fighters coming in from the rear at that moment was a nightmare scenario that the formation's defensive doctrine had not adequately prepared for. The tail gunners and waist gunners would open fire the instant the fighters were visible, but the Sturmgruppe's armoured FW-19Os could absorb hits from .50 caliber fire that would have downed a standard fighter, closing the distance relentlessly until they were firing at point-blank range. The bomber crews responded to all of this the way combat soldiers always respond to mortal threats sustained over time, with a mixture of black humour, ritual, and the profoundly human need to find meaning in what they were being asked to endure. Crews developed superstitions, lucky jackets that had survived multiple missions, particular seats in the briefing room, rituals before takeoff, the same prayer, the same sequence of personal preparations, the same words exchanged with the ground crew. One pilot in the 100th Bomb Group, a unit that suffered such catastrophic losses it became known as the Bloody 100th, carried a photograph of his younger sister on every mission, tucked into the left breast pocket of his jacket, specifically positioned so that if he was hit in the chest, it would be the first thing that stopped the fragment. He completed his tour with the photograph intact. Others were not so lucky with their talismans, but the talismans persisted anyway because the alternative, facing the randomness of survival and death without any framework of meaning, was psychologically untenable. The 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts earned its terrible nickname through a series of missions in 1943 that reduced some individual squadrons to a handful of aircraft. On October 8, 1943, the 100th lost 7 aircraft out of 16 dispatched on a mission to Bremen. 3 days later, on October 10th, it lost 12 out of 13 on the Munster mission, including the aircraft carrying the group commander's crew. The Munster mission was particularly brutal in its psychological effects because the 100th was flying in the tail-end position of the formation, the most exposed position, the position that German fighters hit first and hardest. The other groups in the formation suffered losses. The 100th was virtually annihilated. In a single day, the group lost 120 men, killed, captured, missing. The survivors who returned to Thorpe Abbotts that evening came back to a base that had lost nearly its entire complement of experienced crews in the space of 3 hours. There were empty seats in the mess hall that night, empty chairs in the barracks, personal effects that no one would claim for days because the process of officially recording men as missing, then as killed in action, then of notifying their families took time that the men who were left didn't have because they were scheduled to fly again in 48 hours. This was the reality that the doctrine of strategic daylight bombing demanded, and this was the reality that the men who flew the B-17 lived with, mission after mission, until either their tour was done or they were not. Phase 3. Imagine you are the ball turret gunner. It is October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday as it would come to be known, and you are somewhere over central Germany, part of a force of 291 B-17s headed for Schweinfurt, where the German ball-bearing industry is concentrated in a set of factories that American strategic planners have convinced themselves, not entirely without reason, are one of the genuine bottlenecks of German war production. You have been in the turret for 4 hours. You cannot feel your feet. Your hands, inside the silk inners and the heavy outer gloves, are functioning, but barely. The muscles have been fighting the cold since the aircraft climbed above 10,000 feet 2 hours ago, and now there is a dull, increasingly alarming numbness spreading up from the fingertips. Through the plexiglass panel beneath you, you can see the German countryside 6 miles below, a patchwork of fields and forests interrupted by the grey smudge of towns. The contrails from your own formation spread behind you in the pale blue sky. You're also watching the sky around and below the aircraft because that is your job, and because German fighters are coming. You can see them already. Dark specks against the haze to the east, forming up, preparing. You call them out on the interphone. Your voice, muffled by the oxygen mask and slightly distorted by the radio, carries to every position in the aircraft. The first fighter attack catches the low squadron, the most exposed position in the formation, the position that takes the most losses. An FW-190 comes in from the low 6 o'clock, rolling in on a B-17 that has drifted slightly out of position, the pilot threading the gap between aircraft with the casual precision of a man who has done this many times. You can see the flashes from its cannon before you hear anything. At altitude, sound is strange, compressed, often arriving late or not at all. The B-17, it hits shudders, drops a wing, and then the wing comes off entirely, shearing at the root in a way that seems almost mechanical, almost clean, and the aircraft spins away from the formation, trailing fire from the stub of the wing. You watch it. You track it until it disappears into the cloud layer below. You count the parachutes. Two parachutes out of a crew of 10. You return to scanning your sector. There are more fighters. This is what Black Thursday actually looked like from the inside of a ball turret, and it was a view that approximately 257 surviving crewmen from the October 14th Schweinfurt mission carried home with them. Or more precisely, carried home inside them, never fully putting it down. The mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943 was the second deep penetration raid against the city's ball-bearing factories. The first had been on August 17th, when the 8th Air Force had split its forces to simultaneously hit Regensburg and Schweinfurt, losing 60 aircraft in a single day in what was then the most costly mission in the history of American strategic bombing. The August raid had damaged the Schweinfurt factories significantly, but not enough to stop production, and the Germans had worked frantically to repair the damage and disperse some production. The October mission was intended to finish the job. Instead, it finished the 8th Air Force's ability to conduct deep penetration raids for the next several months. The German air defense system in October 1943 was at the peak of its effectiveness. The long-range P-51 Mustang escorts that would eventually neutralize the Luftwaffe fighter threat had not yet arrived in sufficient numbers. The P-47 Thunderbolts that provided fighter escort for the bomber formations had enough range to accompany the bombers to the German border, roughly, but no farther. The German fighter controllers knew this, and they had learned to position their forces to meet the bombers after the escorts turned back, using the precise moment when the bombers were stripped of their protection. On October 14th, approximately 300 German fighters of various types were waiting for the escort to reach its range limit and turn away. What followed was a running battle that lasted approximately 90 minutes, from the point where the escorts turned back to the target and the return journey to the point where the German fighters ran low on ammunition or fuel. In those 90 minutes, the German fighters shot down 60 B-17 outright and badly damaged dozens more. When the surviving aircraft reached Schweinfurt and dropped their bombs through heavy cloud cover over a city now protected by the concentrated fire of dozens of 88mm flak batteries, 5 more aircraft were lost to flak. On the return journey, aircraft that were trailing smoke, aircraft that had lost engines, aircraft that were structurally compromised attracted every available German fighter like blood attracting sharks. More aircraft went down on the way home. When the final count was completed, 60 B-17 had been lost. 600 men. Another 138 aircraft returned damaged, 17 of those so severely that they were written off as beyond repair. Of the crews that returned, 43 men were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization. Across the entire mission, approximately 650 men had been killed, wounded, or captured. The 8th Air Force's leadership looked at those numbers and drew the only conclusion that was possible. Unescorted daylight bombing of deep targets in Germany was not a strategy. It was a method of destruction. The missions to Schweinfurt, both of them, and particularly the October mission, had not even definitively destroyed their targets. Post-war analysis revealed that German ball-bearing production had recovered within months. Albert Speer, the Reich Armaments Minister, had been terrified by the August raid and had begun immediately dispersing ball-bearing production to locations throughout the Reich, substituting sleeve bearings for ball bearings where possible and drawing on reserves. By the time Black Thursday happened, the Schweinfurt factories were already less critical than American intelligence estimated. The men who died over Schweinfurt died for a target that was not decisive, using a method that could not be sustained, in a strategy built on assumptions that were proving, in the most brutal possible way, to be incorrect. This is not a criticism of the men who flew those missions. This is a criticism of the theory that sent them there. The men who climbed into those B-17s on October 14th and flew to Schweinfurt were executing their orders with extraordinary courage and remarkable skill. They hit their target, or tried to, through conditions of opposition that would have broken most military organizations. The fault lies with the doctrine that assured them, and everyone else, that the mission was achievable at an acceptable cost. It was not. You need to understand what it was like to be inside one of those aircraft as the German fighters swarmed the formation, because statistics don't convey it. You were in the waist position, both windows open to the -50-degree air, and you are firing your .50 caliber, almost continuously now because the fighters are pressing in from the sides in coordinated waves, one after another, and every time one breaks away, another fills the angle. Your gun is hot. You can smell the cordite even through your oxygen mask, the acrid bite of spent propellant, and you've burned through 2 ammunition boxes already. Your partner on the other side of the fuselage is shouting something on the interphone, but you can't make it out over the roar of the engines and the hammering of your own gun. You catch a glimpse of movement above and to the right, and you swing your gun and fire before you consciously decide to, purely on training and adrenaline, and something passes so close to the aircraft that the slipstream of its passage buffets the open window and nearly knocks you off your footing. You don't know if you hit it. You don't have time to check. There's another one coming in. Then there's a sound like someone swinging a metal bat against the fuselage, and a hole appears in the aluminum skin, 6 inches from your head, ragged-edged and roughly the size of your fist, with weak winter light streaming through it, and a spray of aluminum fragments that rattles against your helmet and your flight suit. Shrapnel, or a .30 caliber round. You don't know which, and it doesn't matter. You're still standing. Your gun is still working. You keep firing. The psychological experience of sustained combat at altitude was, in medical terms, a form of acute stress that the Army Air Forces recognized, named, and largely failed to adequately address. They called it operational fatigue, a deliberately vague term that covered everything from genuine post-traumatic stress disorder to simple exhaustion to the specific and profound psychological damage that came from watching your friends die repeatedly over many months. The Army Air Forces had psychiatrists attached to bomb groups, and these men did what they could, which was often not much. The standard treatment for operational fatigue was rest, removal from flying status for a period, sometimes a week, sometimes longer, with opportunities to leave the base and do something normal. English pubs in the surrounding villages played a critical role in the mental health of the 8th Air Force, providing a space where men could go and be, for a few hours, not aircrew, not gunners, not bombardiers, but simply young men having a drink in a warm room. But rest was a limited resource. The 8th Air Force's operational requirements meant that the intervals between missions were often very short, days, sometimes less. Men who needed more than a brief rest were often pushed back into the rotation before they were ready because the replacement pipeline couldn't keep pace with the losses, and the mission schedule was driven by strategic requirements that didn't have much patience for individual psychology. And some men, a significant minority but enough to matter, didn't respond to rest at all. They had seen too much. They had gone past a threshold that rest couldn't bring them back from. These men were classified as LMF, lacking moral fibre, a British term that the Americans adopted and that functioned as a permanent stigma. LMF classification meant removal from flying status, potential demotion, and the specific shame of being identified as someone who had refused to face what his colleagues were still facing. The men who received LMF designations were, in many cases, men who had simply been broken by an experience that no human nervous system was designed to endure. The stigma they received in return was one of the uglier aspects of an otherwise remarkable military enterprise. The specific horror of a bailout at altitude deserves its own examination, because it was the scenario that every crew member thought about and prepared for and hoped would never happen, and that for tens of thousands of men in B-17 over Europe did happen. The signal to bail out was simple: The pilot rang the bailout alarm, a bell or a horn depending on the aircraft, and every man who could do so immediately prepared to jump. Prepared in this context meant locating and attaching your parachute, which might have been stored several feet from your position, and reaching the nearest exit. For the pilot and co-pilot, the exits were the cockpit side windows and the nose hatch. For the bombardier and navigator, the nose hatch or the forward escape hatch. For the radio operator, a hatch in the top of the fuselage. For the waist gunners, the waist windows themselves. For the tail gunner, a small door in the tail section. For the ball turret gunner, the sequence already described, dependent on hydraulics, dependent on time and functioning systems. Men who bailed out at altitude faced a set of immediate challenges that the training film had covered, but that reality made far more complex. The temperature outside the aircraft was the same -50-degree cold they'd been enduring inside, and the wind blast of exiting an aircraft at 200 miles per hour at altitude was equivalent to a physical blow. The parachute was typically not deployed immediately. Crewmen were trained to wait to fall to lower altitude, where the air was thicker and the temperature was survivable, before pulling the ripcord, both to avoid being strafed by enemy fighters while descending helplessly and to ensure they had enough oxygen to remain conscious on the way down. This required a specific kind of cold-blooded nerve to exit a burning aircraft and then fall freely for several miles before pulling the cord. Men who panicked and pulled too early found themselves hanging in very thin air for a very long time, exposed to the cold and potentially to fighter attack. Men who waited too long or who lost consciousness on the way down from hypoxia or wounds sometimes never pulled at all. If they landed in Germany or occupied territory, they were generally captured, and captured by the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe, while unpleasant, typically offered the protections of the Geneva Convention, prisoner of war status, transport to a Stalag Luft, the basic certainty of survival for the duration. This was not to be taken for granted, and it was not universal. There were incidents, documented, acknowledged, of downed Allied airmen being killed after capture, particularly in the last year of the war, as German civilian morale collapsed, and the connection between the man parachuting from a burning aircraft and the burning cities below became direct and visceral in the minds of the people watching. One of the darker documented phenomena of the late war bombing campaign was the occasional lynching of downed Allied airmen by German civilians, particularly in heavily bombed cities. The Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht were generally better at protecting their prisoners than the local population was at the moment of capture, and the standard instruction to downed airmen was to surrender to the first uniformed German they could find, rather than falling into the hands of a crowd. For those who came down over the North Sea or the English Channel, the approaches and exits of nearly every 8th Air Force mission, particularly in the earlier years when the range of operations was more limited, the situation was different, and in some ways, worse. The waters of the North Sea are cold enough to be lethal within minutes to an unprotected swimmer. Water temperature in those latitudes rarely rises above 15 degrees Celsius and is often much colder and thermal. Incapacitation, the loss of swimming ability due to cold, occurs within minutes. The Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force both operated air-sea rescue services, equipped with fast motor launches, Catalina flying boats, and eventually specialised rescue aircraft like the Supermarine Walrus, and these services saved thousands of lives over the course of the war. But they operated in seas that were frequently rough, in weather that was frequently marginal, and not every downed airman who came down in the water was found in time. Some were found hours or days later, already dead from exposure. Some were never found at all. The aircrew who survived a bailout and were captured in Germany entered the Luftwaffe prisoner of war system, which was administered by the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe and run primarily through the Dulag Luft Transit Camp at Oberrussell, near Frankfurt, and the network of Stalag Luft camps distributed across the Reich and occupied territory. The camps were, by the standards of Wehrmacht POW camps for Soviet prisoners, or SS concentration camp standards, relatively humane. They followed the Geneva Convention's basic provisions for officer and NCO treatment, provided food and shelter, and allowed Red Cross packages to supplement the generally inadequate German ration. This is not to say they were pleasant, they were not. The food was chronically insufficient, the accommodation was overcrowded, the boredom and psychological stress of captivity were corrosive over months and years, and the uncertainty about the war's outcome and one's own future was a constant companion. But men survived the Stalag Luft camps. Most of the men who entered them came home after the war. The Pacific was different. If you came down over Japanese-held territory after a B-17 bombing mission in the Pacific Theater, your prospects for survival and humane treatment were substantially worse. The Japanese military's cultural attitude toward capture, which held that surrender was shameful, that a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his honor and by extension his claim to consideration, influenced the treatment of Allied prisoners in ways that range from brutal to catastrophic. American airmen who parachuted over Japanese-held islands or waters were sometimes killed upon capture. Some were subjected to medical experimentation. Some were beheaded by unit commanders who treated the killing of a captured enemy as an appropriate exercise of military prerogative. The survival rate for Allied airmen captured by Japanese forces was significantly lower than for those captured by German forces, and the treatment endured by those who did survive captivity was, in many documented cases, among the most severe inflicted on Allied prisoners anywhere in the war. The B-17's role in the Pacific is often overshadowed by its European service, but the men who flew those missions over Rabaul, over the Marianas, over the Philippine Sea, faced the possibility of Japanese captivity, with a clarity about what it likely meant that added an additional dimension of terror to missions that were already terrifying enough on their own terms. The physical condition of aircraft that returned from heavily contested missions was, in itself, a testament to the B-17's structural integrity and a catalogue of horrors that the maintenance crews on the ground dealt with daily. Aircraft returned with holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through. Aircraft returned with entire sections of tail surface shot away. Aircraft returned with 2 engines feathered and a 3rd running rough. Aircraft returned, and this happened multiple times, documented in multiple bomb groups' records, with the nose section largely destroyed, the bombardier dead, and the navigator flying from the nose hatch, opening into the slipstream for hours until the aircraft landed. The ground crews who met the returning aircraft sometimes had to remove dead crew members who were too seriously wounded to have survived the flight home and had died during the transit. On particularly bad days, the ground crews might wait for aircraft that never came back, standing on the hard stand in the English damp, watching the empty sky where their aircraft should have been appearing, and gradually understanding that they were not going to appear. The air crews who flew these missions developed a specific kind of relationship with the ground crews that maintained their aircraft, and it was one of the more human and moving aspects of the bombing campaign. The crew chief, the senior NCO, responsible for a specific aircraft, often flew with that aircraft on its first combat mission, simply to be there, and thereafter tracked every mission and every piece of damage with the attention of a parent watching over a child. Ground crews worked through English nights in English weather, cold, wet, foggy, to have aircraft repaired and ready for the next morning's mission. They repaired flak holes with aluminum patches. They replaced engines, sometimes in the dark, sometimes under time pressure that made the work dangerous. They fueled and armed and inspected and patched, and when an aircraft they had maintained came back from a mission with a crew member's blood on the interior and bullet holes through the fuselage, they cleaned it up and fixed it and had it ready to go again, because that was their part of the war, and they knew it as well as anyone who ever flew in it. The specific experiences of individual crew members who survived the worst the German air defense could offer in 1943 and 1944 fill entire books, and it would be impossible to give them all the space they deserve here. But a few stand out as emblematic of what the bombing campaign meant at the individual level. Robert Morgan was the pilot of the Memphis Belle, one of the most famous B-17 of the war. Famous primarily because it was among the first in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions with its original crew intact, and because the Army Air Forces recognized it as an extraordinary propaganda opportunity and brought the crew home to tour the United States selling war bonds. Morgan was 23 years old when he flew his last mission. The Memphis Belle's 25 missions had included encounters with German fighters on nearly every one of them, several serious flak hits that damaged the aircraft significantly, a mission during which a waist gunner was so seriously wounded that Morgan had to break from formation to rush him to a lower altitude where he had a chance of surviving, and at least 3 separate missions where the aircraft returned to Bassingbourn with damage severe enough that a reasonable person might have questioned whether it was repairable in time for the next mission. Morgan and his crew survived all of it. They were not typical. They were what survival looked like. At the other end of the probability distribution was the crew of a B-17F named My Prayer from the 91st Bomb Group. On August 17, 1943, the day of the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, my prayer was shot down on its third mission. No parachutes were observed by other crew members in the formation. All 10 men aboard were killed. The crew's average age was 21 years. The youngest member, a ball turret gunner from Texas named Harold Stearns, was 19. He had been in the 91st Bomb Group for 11 days. These two stories, and the thousands of stories that fall between them on the spectrum of survival and death, form the human core of the B-17 bombing campaign. The Memphis Belle crew and the crew of my prayer flew in the same aircraft type, over the same targets, against the same defenses, in the same airspace. What separated them was a combination of skill, experience, crew cohesion, aircraft assignment, formation position, weather, the particular German units they encountered, and pure, random, meaningless luck. There was no formula. There was no way to guarantee survival. There was only the mission and the men who flew it and the enormous grinding randomness of industrial-scale aerial combat. The experience of the 8th Air Force bomber crews in 1943 forced a fundamental reconsideration of strategic bombing doctrine, though it took time for institutional momentum to carry the change through. The losses at Schweinfurt in August and October, combined with continuing heavy losses on other deep penetration missions, eventually produced a de facto operational suspension of deep penetration raids through the winter of 1943, while the problem of fighter escort was resolved. The solution was the North American P-51 Mustang, and the story of how the P-51 saved the strategic bombing campaign is one of the great technical and operational transformations of the war. But it is worth understanding that it did not arrive quickly enough to save the men who died in the autumn of 1943. The Mustang, in its definitive P-51D form, combined the airframe and aerodynamics of the original North American design with the Packard-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a pairing that produced an aircraft that was fast at altitude, extremely maneuverable, and possessed of a range that, with drop tanks, allowed it to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. When P-51 groups began operating in significant numbers in early 1944, the impact was immediate and dramatic. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force bombed Berlin for the first time in daylight, a mission that was both an extraordinary feat of arms and a profound psychological statement. The Luftwaffe's reaction was fierce. They lost 80 fighters in a single day trying to stop the bombers. The P-51 escorts shot down 82 German aircraft. For the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps, losses at that rate were unsustainable. The campaign to attrit the Luftwaffe's fighter force was working, but it was working by giving the German fighters the thing they wanted, combat, and defeating them in that combat, and the cost in bomber crews of doing so was still significant through 1944. B-17 crews continued to die. The missions to oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation hubs, and cities continued to be dangerous, lethal operations. The P-51s changed the arithmetic fundamentally, but they did not make the missions safe. By the late summer of 1944, the character of the air war over Germany was changing in ways that reflected the fundamental shift in military power on all fronts. The Normandy invasion had succeeded. Allied armies were pushing through France. The strategic situation that German air defense was defending was deteriorating on every front, and the Luftwaffe's ability to mount the kind of massed, organized resistance that had characterized 1943 was collapsing under the pressure of fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the requirement to defend against both the American 8th Air Force from England and the American 15th Air Force from Italy. German jet aircraft, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, began appearing in 1944, and the speed differential between the jet and the B-17 was alarming enough to send a shudder through the bomber crews who first encountered them. A Me-262 attacking a B-17 formation could approach at speeds the defensive gunners had no effective means of tracking. The closing speed was too high, the target was too fast, and the fighter's jet engines produced no propeller-driven vibration to give warning. But the Me-262 arrived too late and in too small numbers to reverse the strategic balance, and its operational effectiveness was significantly compromised by Allied attacks on the airfields and fuel supplies the jets required. Phase 4. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was, in many ways, the worst that the 8th Air Force's ground support personnel experienced, even as the strategic situation was improving. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the West, launched in December 1944, temporarily disrupted the bombing campaign as resources were diverted and weather-grounded operations. But when the weather cleared, the campaign resumed with a ferocity that reflected both the Allies' strategic dominance and a genuine calculation that the more rapidly German industrial and transportation capacity was destroyed, the sooner the war would end and fewer lives on all sides would be lost. The bombing campaign of late 1944 and early 1945 targeted Germany's oil infrastructure with a systematic precision that proved, in retrospect, to be among the most decisive contributions of the strategic bombing campaign to the final defeat of the Wehrmacht. By the autumn of 1944, synthetic oil production had been reduced by over 90% from its peak, and German military operations were increasingly paralysed by fuel shortages. The magnificent Tiger II tanks that outclassed anything the Allies fielded in a direct engagement were sometimes literally running out of fuel in place, abandoned by their crews because the bombing campaign had destroyed the refineries and synthetic fuel plants that kept them moving. For the B-17 crews flying these late-war missions, the experience was both easier and harder than it had been at the peak of the losses in 1943. Easier because the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was a shadow of its 1943 peak, its experienced pilot corps decimated by 3 years of attrition, and its fuel supplies critically reduced by the same bombing campaign the crews were flying. The terrifying mass fighter attacks of 1943, the waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s making coordinated attacks on the formation from multiple angles, were rarer now. German fighters still appeared, and when they did, they were still dangerous. But the numbers had changed decisively. Harder because the German flak arm had, if anything, improved throughout the war. The guns were better directed, the radar fire control was more sophisticated, and the concentration of flak guns around key targets had increased as the Germans pulled weapons from other fronts to defend their critical installations. Late-war B-17 crews often reported that the flak was worse in 1944 and 1945 than it had been in 1943, even as the fighter opposition diminished. They flew through some of the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire in history over oil targets like Mersburg, Leuna, and Berlin, missions that veterans who had survived 1943 nonetheless described as among the most terrifying they experienced. The 8th Air Force's last major combat loss was on April 25, 1945, with missions to the Skoda works at Pilsen and to Salzburg. By that point, German air defences were effectively collapsed. Many flak guns had been pulled back to defend against the advancing Allied ground forces, and the Luftwaffe was operating in its death throes with catastrophically reduced fuel supplies and experienced personnel. The aircraft that flew those final missions flew into a sky that was almost eerily quiet compared to what it had been 18 months earlier, and the men aboard them knew with a certainty that their predecessors in 1943 had not been able to feel that they were going to come home. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, and the crews of the 8th Air Force who were still in England celebrated with a fervour that was informed by everything they had survived, everything they had seen, and everyone they had lost. The Pacific B-17 campaign had a different trajectory. The aircraft that had equipped the Far East Air Force when the Japanese struck at Clark Field in the Philippines on December 8, 1941, destroying 17 of the 19 B-17 on the ground in what was a catastrophic failure of intelligence and readiness, had fought through the desperate early months of the Pacific War in conditions that were even less hospitable than Europe. The B-17 that attacked Japanese shipping in the early days of the war did so without adequate fighter escort, without accurate intelligence about target locations, without the logistical support chain that the 8th Air Force would eventually develop in England. The bombing accuracy achieved against moving ships was poor. The inherent difficulty of hitting a maneuvering vessel from high altitude with a bomb sight designed for fixed targets was not something that doctrine had adequately addressed, and the losses to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire were significant. As the war progressed in the Pacific, the B-17 was gradually superseded by the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a much more capable aircraft specifically designed for the long overwater ranges of the Pacific theatre. By 1944, the B-29 was conducting the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands, while B-17S were relegated to shorter-range missions and increasingly to training roles. The crews who had flown B-17s in the Pacific through 1942 and 1943 had done so in conditions of extreme isolation, often operating from improvised bases in Australia and the Southwest Pacific, with maintenance facilities that were primitive compared to what 8th Air Force crews took for granted in England, against an enemy who extended no mercy to downed airmen and who controlled the ocean between their targets and home. Their experience, less celebrated than the European campaign but no less harrowing, deserves its own recognition. What happened to the men who survived the B-17 campaign and came home? The answer is complicated, and it is one that American society spent several decades struggling to understand and address. The men who returned, and there were many of them, hundreds of thousands, returned to a country that was eager to celebrate them as heroes and considerably less equipped to understand what being a hero in those terms had actually done to them. The greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw would later call them, was a generation that had been taught by both the Depression and the war to endure and continue, to push through difficulty rather than acknowledge it, to regard open expressions of psychological distress as a form of weakness. This was not peculiar to bomber crews. It characterized returning veterans of all services. But the specific nature of what bomber crews had experienced, the repeated exposure to mortal danger, the regular witnessing of violent death, the sustained psychological pressure of missions that asked them to perform highly skilled work in conditions of extreme terror over extended periods, produced psychological damage that was often deep, durable, and poorly understood. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized clinical category in 1945. What it was called then, if it was called anything official, was shell shock, combat fatigue, operational exhaustion, or nothing at all. Men came home and found jobs and married and raised children and built the post-war American middle class, and some percentage of them carried the weight of their experience in ways that were invisible until they weren't. Until the nightmares became impossible to ignore, until the reflexive startle response became embarrassing in its regularity, until the pervasive disconnection from emotional life became too obvious for family members to pretend away. Some men drank. Some men raged in ways that frightened their families. Some men simply went quiet about the war and stayed quiet for the rest of their lives, never telling their children or grandchildren what they had seen and done because there was no language available to them that could make it comprehensible to someone who had not been there. Others, a remarkable number actually, found a way to integrate what they had experienced into lives that were functional, even flourishing, without pretending that the experience had not occurred. The veterans' associations that formed after the war, the 8th Air Force Historical Society, the individual bomb group associations, became communities of shared experience and shared language. Places where men who had been ball turret gunners could talk to other men who had been ball turret gunners without having to explain what that meant. These associations preserved the records, the oral histories, the photographs, and the memories of the campaign for decades, and the historians and documentary filmmakers and writers who have subsequently told the story of the strategic bombing campaign owe an immense debt to the veterans who gave their time and their recollections to make that telling possible. The physical legacy of the B-17 is visible in a handful of airworthy examples that are maintained at enormous expense by aviation museums and private foundations in the United States and elsewhere. Fewer than 50 B-17s survive in any condition, and the airworthy ones, perhaps a dozen or fewer at any given time given the challenges of maintaining 80-year-old aircraft, fly at air shows and memorial events, giving the modern public some approximation of what the aircraft looked and sounded like. The sound of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines at full power is something that anyone who has heard it at close range remembers. A deep, complex, overlapping roar that carries a kind of authority that modern turbine engines, however powerful, don't quite replicate. Veterans who attended air shows in their later years and heard that sound again reported responses that were immediate and profound. Memories surfacing with a physical force that the years had not diminished. The smell of aviation gasoline, the vibration through the airframe, the view from the waist window of the ground receding, these sensory memories were stored at a level of the nervous system that decades of civilian life had not touched. The bombing campaign's strategic legacy is a question that historians and strategists have argued about for 70 years without reaching a definitive consensus. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which conducted an exhaustive study of the bombing campaign's effects immediately after the war using German records and interviews with German officials, reached conclusions that were both validating and sobering. The bombing had significantly disrupted German industrial production, particularly in the second half of the war. The oil campaign had been decisive. German military capability in the final months of the war was genuinely constrained by fuel shortages directly attributable to the bombing. The transportation campaign in the final months had contributed substantially to the Wehrmacht's inability to move supplies and reinforcements. But the morale bombing, the attacks on German cities intended to break civilian will, had demonstrably failed to achieve its objective. German civilian morale, battered and traumatized, had not translated into pressure on the Nazi government to seek peace. If anything, it had hardened. The moral cost of the civilian bombing campaign, and this is not an issue that can be easily set aside, was immense, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German civilians in raids that did not achieve their stated objectives are a part of the bombing campaign's history that honest evaluation cannot ignore. None of this changes what the men who flew the B-17S did. They did not design the doctrine, they did not choose the targets. They did not decide that daylight precision bombing was the correct strategy, or that the loss rates were acceptable, or that particular cities should be bombed. They were given their targets and their routes and their bomb loads, and they climbed into their aircraft at dawn and flew east, and they did their jobs in conditions of sustained mortal danger that would have broken most human beings, and they came back. Those who came back changed in ways that no post-war normal could fully account for. The 8th Air Force flew more than 700,000 individual aircraft sorties from England between 1942 and 1945, and the campaign cost it 26,000 men killed and 28,000 taken prisoner, over 47,000 killed, wounded, or captured in total. More American airmen were killed in the European strategic bombing campaign than Marines were killed in the entire Pacific War. The B-17 bore the largest share of these losses, its crews accounting for the vast majority of the 8th Air Force's combat operations through 1944. The 12,731 B-17S, produced by Boeing, Vega, and Douglas during the war years, the largest production run of a four-engine bomber in history, served in every theatre and on every front. But it was the long missions over Germany, from the grey flatlands of East Anglia, that defined what the aircraft meant and what its crews endured. The last B-17 combat mission anywhere in the world was flown not by the United States, but by Brazil, which had received B-17S under Lend-Lease and kept them in service into the 1960s. The last operational B-17 in any military service was retired decades after the young men who flew them over Schweinfurt were already grandfathers. The aircraft outlasted the war, and it outlasted the world that created it, and the men who flew it outlasted both, those who survived anyway carrying the memory of what they had done and what they had seen in the unreachable places where such memories are kept. There is a particular kind of courage that does not get talked about enough in the way we remember wars. It is not the courage of the single dramatic moment, the charge across open ground, the last stand, the rescue under fire. It is the courage of the repeated decision. The courage of climbing into that aircraft on the second mission, knowing what the first was like. On the 10th mission, knowing the statistical odds. On the 20th mission, when you can count the men you knew personally who are now dead or in German prison camps, when you can do the arithmetic of your remaining missions against the arithmetic of the losses in your group, and you climb in anyway. That courage, quiet and terrible and sustained, is what the men of the B-17 crews demonstrated mission after mission, winter after winter, over a sky that was trying to kill them in every way available to industrial civilization's most creative efforts. They were not soldiers who did not know what they were facing. They knew exactly what they were facing. They flew anyway. When we look at the photographs from those years, the young men in front of their aircraft grinning, squinting against the English sun, their leather jackets and garrison caps, and the slightly self-conscious poses of young men being photographed, we are looking at people who, in many cases, did not come back. The ones who did come back carried those photographs in their wallets for the rest of their lives, pulling them out sometimes, looking at the faces of men who had been 20 years old and were gone before 21. The mathematics of what those faces represent, the futures that did not happen, the lives that were not lived, the families that were not raised, is staggering if you let yourself think about it fully. And perhaps that is exactly why we should, because they went up into that sky in those aircraft in that cold, and they flew toward the thing that was trying to kill them, and they did not stop. And the least we can do is remember, clearly and honestly, exactly what that cost them and exactly what it required. Consider what the ball turret gunner represented in that equation. He was often the youngest man on the aircraft. He was chosen for his position specifically because he was small enough to fold himself into a sphere 44 inches across, small enough to tuck his knees to his chest and remain there for 10 hours while the aircraft around him was hit, was burning, was falling. He was selected for the most mechanically dependent position on the aircraft, the one where his survival was most dependent on hydraulics and correct alignment and systems that enemy fire could destroy in an instant, not because the army thought that was appropriate, but because the turret demanded it. He climbed in anyway, mission after mission, knowing the hydraulics might fail, knowing the hatch above him might become inaccessible, knowing that the ground was 6 miles below him and his parachute was not within reach. He climbed in and he folded himself into that steel sphere and he fired his guns and he did his job because that was what the mission required, and because the 9 men on the aircraft above him were depending on him to cover the sector of sky that only he could see. There is something almost impossibly concentrated in that image. One young man alone in a metal ball, the sky and the earth visible through a pane of glass beneath his feet, 20mm cannon rounds from Focke-Wulf fighters detonating around the aircraft while the formation's defensive fire hammers outward in every direction, and this single 19-year-old from a small town somewhere in America looking through his optical sight and doing the work he was trained to do. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a machine, a marvel of American industrial and aeronautical engineering, and it earned every word of its famous nickname. But the Fortress was not the aluminum and the Wright Cyclone engines and the Sperry bomb sight. The Fortress was the 10 men inside it, and what they were willing to endure and what they refused to let stop them. The aircraft was merely the vessel for a particular and remarkable kind of human courage, one that does not announce itself, does not dramatize itself, does not ask for recognition, but simply keeps showing up, keeps climbing in, keeps flying east until it is done or until it cannot continue. That is the story that the B-17 actually tells, if you are willing to look past the famous silhouette and the Hollywood mythology and the air show performances, and see the men who made it mean something.